Hello, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students, friends, enemies. Welcome to this opening webinar of the Fall 2021 Transatlantic Lecture Series that the America-Europe Fund and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven are organizing. Our theme of today is a very special one. As you all know, this coming Saturday, we will commemorate 20 years of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. 9/11/2001, that Tuesday morning in New York and the Washington, D.C. area, it was 3 p.m. for us in the Brussels area, is forever written down in our collective memory. And the trauma, the tragedy, all the things that came out of it are deep in our minds. And of course, we think in the very first place of the thousands of victims and their families of that day. This webinar is about the deeper and broader ramifications of the events of 9/11 for the international order, for international relations, for international law. And I think it's fair to say that few events have sent broader and deeper shockwaves through the international order than the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The United States, being attacked on its own soil, immediately received strong support from the European Union and its member states, as well as from its NATO allies. The US also took vigorous actions, both multilaterally through the United Nations Security Council, for instance, bilaterally with its allies, but also unilaterally. And you will remember those notions, from the global war on terror to the military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, the special military tribunals, the USA Patriot Act. The first years after 9/11 have seen indeed many dramatic developments. And in those years, notably in the wake of other terrorist attacks in Madrid in March 2004 and in London in July 2005, also the European Union and its member states have adopted many counter-terrorist and security measures and legislation, deeply affecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. 20 years later, I think it's fair to ask ourselves, what have been the long-term consequences and the impact of the 9/11 attacks upon international relations, international law, upon our American and European societies, upon transatlantic relations? And we have two highly distinguished experts, one American, one European, who will engage in a conversation and take questions from the audience. Let me quickly introduce them. Dr. Bibi van Ginkel, his founder of the Global Connection, I should say, has worked as a research fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism and as a senior research fellow at the security unit of the Netherlands Institute for International Relations, Klingendaal. Her expertise spans the whole variety, I would say, of focus areas of counterterrorism and countering and preventing violent extremism, from rule of law trends, issues to trends, threat developments, response policies, prevention strategies, combination with development aid initiatives. In a way, you can ask Bibi all you want about those issues. And I hope you will do also using the Q&A facility for the participants. Then we have Professor Doug Castle, who is an American legal scholar, a practitioner, and a commentator on matters of human rights. And I should say much more than human rights. He's an emeritus professor of law at Notre Dame Law School in the United States, where he taught public international law, international human rights, international humanitarian, and international criminal law. In fact, we go back a very long time, and even just after the 9/11 attacks, Doug and us in Leuven co-organized transatlantic lectures and conferences on a whole host of issues, including in 2002 a transatlantic conference in the European Parliament in Brussels about the fight against terrorism and the two perspectives from the US and Europe. Following his retirement from academia, Professor Castle has joined the global law firm of King & Spalding as a counsel on business and human rights. He was elected by the Organization of American States 4 times to serve on the board of the Justice Studies Center of the Americas, of which he was the president. And in 2017, he was the US nominee to serve on the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Now, before starting this transatlantic conversation, please allow me to just say a few words about the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. The fund is now 1 year old. We were established in October 2020, and its aim is to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of, and I would add, stronger relations between the US and the European Union, including Belgium as, I would say, the center of European institutions and NATO. You know that Brussels was visited by US President Biden in June of this year. And as you know, this country has a long-standing tradition of hosting American business headquarters also in Europe. And so the fund, the America-Europe Fund, promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research at KU Leuven aimed at strengthening comparative knowledge of the American and European societies. And I'm very happy to let you know that this coming academic year, we will indeed have our first program in which we have comparative American-European studies with a great number of new courses and lecturers in Leuven. So let me now turn immediately to our distinguished speakers. Again, the goal is to have a dialogue and a conversation. So sufficiently informal and sufficiently interactive, including with you, the participants. And I'm going to start, if I may, with a question to Professor Doug Castle. To what extent is the US today still waging a global war on terror? This was the expression of President George W. Bush back in those days. And to, let's say, illustrate, I'm going to refer to the address of President Biden to the US Congress in April of this year, but also to a speech he gave in June before the G7 summit. And there, President Biden, in a way, supplanted terrorism with the challenges of stamping out a pandemic, fighting climate change, preparing American allies for a long competition with China, revitalizing democracy. Quite a change of an agenda, you would say, compared to the huge challenge of fighting terrorism launched 20 years ago. So if you could, Professor Castle, explain a bit more how such a fundamental change of agenda setting in Washington, D.C. could affect this, what I would call, vast fabric of the fight against terrorism. Please.
Well, first of all, Jan, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this program and the dialogue, which I'm sure will be interesting. And second, I should clarify that anything I say is stated in my personal capacity and does not necessarily represent the views of my law firm or any of its clients. You're right that President Biden hoped to have and still hopes to have other and higher priorities. But the so-called war on terror, or whatever you want to call it, continues. In fact, by coincidence, this very day, the president's senior advisor on Homeland Security has delivered an address to the Atlantic Council in which she makes clear that the counterterrorism efforts by the United States continue and must continue. However, there are two very significant differences from before. First, we are now going to have a much more flexible and adaptable set of techniques for countering terrorism. What does that mean? Well, to put it bluntly, we're no longer going to do it by attacking and invading countries with tens of thousands of soldiers on the ground. Instead, we are going to use techniques such as the drones that supposedly killed two ISIS-K members in Afghanistan a week ago, and about which President Biden said immediately afterward that anyone who threatens the United States or its troops can expect to be met with a response. And the expectation is that now that we are no longer with boots on the ground in so many countries where combat takes place, we will rely even more heavily on drones. That said, when Biden came into office, he announced that there would be a review of U.S. drone attack policy. That review continues, and I think will certainly be influenced by the recent developments in Afghanistan. The other fundamental change in U.S. counterterrorism policy and activities is a response to the attacks on the Capitol on January 6th of this year. That is now a new focus on domestic terrorism. In June of this year, for the first time ever, the United States published an official policy on combating domestic terrorism. The intelligence community in the U.S. now considers it to be the highest priority because so many of the resources of the FBI and the intelligence community were devoted to overseas threats during the last 20 years. There was a tremendous failure to keep sufficient intelligence tabs on some of the right-wing extremist groups that we saw come forth on January 6th. There's now a determination not to allow that to continue to happen. So the war on terror continues, but in different ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe a very quick side question. You spoke about drones, and we know, of course, that this was already a practice and a policy under President Obama with some spectacular results, but also with some, say, very notable kind of, well, what humanitarian law experts would call collateral damage events. And so could I have a quick assessment from you how you assess the legality of such drone attacks from a legal point of view, in particular knowing that these are actually kind of summary executions without any form of trial? What do you think of that, Doug?
My answer is not going to make me very popular with the legal advisor's office at the State Department. I consider the use of drones certainly outside the context of an ongoing law of war scenario, such as recently in Afghanistan. Certainly anywhere else outside a battlefield, I consider the use of drones to be unlawful. First of all, unlawful summary execution. And secondly, as you pointed out, there is often collateral damage in the form of killing civilians along with whoever might be the target of the drone attack, even if we were to assume that the target of the drone attack were guilty of anything, which we don't know because the target had no opportunity for a trial, and the attack is based purely on intelligence information, which is often faulty or otherwise flawed. Inside a recognized battleground, I think drones can be used in limited circumstances, but there needs to be close attention paid to civilian casualties. One of the problems with the Obama use of drones, which, as you pointed out, was tremendously expanded, was they adopted a rule of thumb that any persons killed who were males of fighting age were presumed to be combatants and not civilians. That is obviously not necessarily true, and it just illustrates the efforts that were made and continue to be made by the United States to justify what many of us outside the confines of the State Department consider to be violations of international law.
Thank you so much. We may come back to the issue of domestic terrorism during this conversation, also from a European point of view. But let me turn to Dr. Bibi van Ginkel, because Bibi, you know that the European Union really never wanted to take over this war-like discourse, the global war on terror of the United States. And in fact, in Europe, even before the European Union took on matters, we talk about things like the Council of Europe and so on. We have a long tradition of fighting terrorism, already the more traditional forms of terrorism in the 1970s. Think of the IRA, think of the Brigati Rossi in Italy, the Rote Armee Fraktion in Germany, and so on. We in Europe tackled these through enhancing criminal cooperation between countries. But still, if you look back now, and that's not 9/11, that is actually November 2015, when you had the horrendous attacks on the Bataclan and other places in Paris. And you know that yesterday just the trial of that, say, attack has started. But if you remember November 2015, the French president, François Hollande, after those attacks said, and I'm going to quote him in French, "C'était des actes de guerre." These were acts of war, which quite literally is almost the same as what President George W. Bush said after the 9/11 attacks. And then France indeed activated what we call the military solidarity clause in the European Union Treaty. They did a lot of things together with the help of other countries in Mali and so on. So I was wondering, Bibi, how do you see that European development? Have things changed also for the Europeans? Please.
Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you also from my side for bringing me to this conversation. I think it's very interesting to reflect on 20 years after 9/11. Let me first say a few words with regard to the position of the EU before I come back to the position of France and how that may have altered that position of the EU. I think indeed within the European context, it's mostly been the law paradigm, as you rightfully pointed out, as opposed to the war paradigm. I think for good reason also. For instance, if we look at research from Rand Corporation, who did some historical research into how terrorist groups end, it turns out that more than 40% is through political processes and more than 40% through police work. And it's only like 7 or 8% through military interference. And there is a rest category of those groups that end by themselves. But if you would take that same pie chart, if you like, and look at where the money goes, and then of course, it looks quite different. But so there's a reason that we do it with a law paradigm and also acted mostly within the international context, bringing those points of view to the international organizations to insist on this law paradigm and this criminal justice approach, and maybe even later also broadening it out to a more of a preventative approach. But looking more closely to France, what is interesting here is that it seems that they always had a tendency to lean a little bit more towards this war language, so to speak. Also because they are facing quite profound challenges in their country, and that has to do with the problems in the banlieues, the suburbs, the radicalization taking place in prison, and they put a lot of people in prison. And I can say that the programs for rehabilitation and reintegration are not working effectively there. There's a lot of polarization in politics also with the Front National that already for a long time was putting the discussions in politics very sharply, and also with the sentiments towards the Muslim communities. And another example that pops to mind is the discussions on the burkini that has some women Muslims choose to wear in order to be able to go to the beach and swim in the sea, or go to a swimming pool, and that in the French society that was really frowned upon, and even at one point there was a talk of forbidding the use of the burkini. So it's always a bit sharp, and I think we can see that also in their response. Obviously, there has been a state of emergency in France for a very long time. They had all kinds of administrative orders that really went overboard and were critically frowned upon by organizations like Amnesty International, also because there is not a profound fair trial principle included in the way that administrative measures are used. So That's quite a different approach than when you look at other countries who also suffered quite severe terrorist attacks, like your country, Belgium. But also if we look, for instance, at Germany, where also quite a number of terrorist attacks have taken place. These responses were quite different. And even though these societies also face challenges for sure, it has never been the same kind of language that we witnessed in France. Meanwhile, the other side of it all, after the attacks on the Bataclan, were also that within Europe, there was this voice of solidarity that did not come to support per se the war paradigm, but rather the societal contract within societies, with all the voices coming forward saying, "Je suis Charlie," also after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and on the attacks on the Bataclan. So we have to see both sides of the developments, I think. Nevertheless, looking at Europe, we should also have an eye on the more critical side to it. Even though it's mostly the law paradigm, we have also seen a tendency to securitization of issues, and moving also within this law paradigm to a more preventative criminal responses, also criminalizing the preparational acts of terrorist attacks, and also entered what I call the age of exceptionalism, where everything is framed as an exceptional situation demanding exceptional powers from the governments to step in and interfere. So it's not without criticism, but I think we are still a little bit different from the language used in the US.
Thank you so much. I turn back to Professor Doug Castle. I mean, like, it's a very rich discussion, and you should feel absolutely free to comment upon each other's reflections. But I remember also that the Europeans, at least fairly shortly after the 9/11 attacks, wanted to also include in the international discourse about fighting terrorism that it should not just be a kind of, fight the terrorists and so on, but that there should also be attention for the underlying causes of terrorism. And that's language which has gradually, I would say, become more prominent also in international statements from the Security Council and so on and so forth. So that language has become more integrated in the discourse of the fight against terrorism. But I wonder to what extent there is really nowadays a real, say, attention and understanding also of the underlying causes of terrorism. Do you have particular thoughts on that, Doug?
Well, I think in the United States, following 9/11, that question would have been tossed out the window.
Yes.
The answer would have been causes schmauzes. 3,000 people have just been killed, and we have to deal with the immediate problem. And then later on, we'll worry about some of those causes. And later on, they did. They thought that they could build a democracy in Iraq. They thought they could build a democracy in Afghanistan. They thought that those countries would adopt Western approaches to the rule of law and to social democracy in one way or another, and they would become little Belgiums and little Netherlands in Central Asia or the Middle East, and there would be no longer any need for terrorism. Unfortunately, that approach was taken by people from Washington who frankly didn't know what they were talking about or thinking about. And the result is they were caught completely flat-footed just within the last month when a Afghan fighting force supposedly consisting of 300,000 fighters trained with millions upon millions of American and European dollars and equipped with billions of dollars worth of equipment over the years, collapsed and refused to fight with very few exceptions. So yes, they understood at some point that you needed to address the causes. They just didn't know how to do it. Now that the shift in the United States is toward domestic terrorism, once again, there is a lot of discussion about what are the causes. of domestic terrorism in the United States, and they run deep and they run long. They have been with the United States since the Constitution of the United States was adopted over 2 centuries ago, with a clause in it that guaranteed the perpetuation in effect of slavery and the granting of additional voting powers to southern states which had slaves, without giving the slaves the right to vote. And they continued through the American Civil War, through the period of racially segregationist laws from the late 1800s into the 1970s and 80s. And they continue in the form of the sort of hatred that you see on the streets of the United States today. The polarization that Dr. van Ginkel referred to in Europe, I don't know who has worse polarization, but in my lifetime, and I'm not a young man, the United States has never been as polarized as it is today. The public opinion polls indicate very clearly that members of the Republican Party have very little trust in the Democrats and vice versa. And until you overcome that kind of polarization, it's not going to be easy to repress right-wing terrorist groups that feed on hate, that feed on racism, that feed on hatred of foreigners, suspicion and fear of foreigners. If you two were not white people from Northern Europe, but if you were black or brown people from states in the global South, you would find a very different reception from, unfortunately, too many people in the United States today. And we're going to have to find ways to overcome that if we expect those people to stop carrying guns and making threats.
Thank you.
If I may, yes, yeah, just a quick word on also this discussion on root causes. What was interesting is also within the United Nations, really the term root causes could not be used in any of the documents within the UN after 9/11. And even if you mentioned that it would seem that you were legitimizing terrorist attacks, like if there could be any reason why you should do that. And it was only after a couple of years I think it was 2005 that they first introduced this phrase, which still couldn't really pronounce root causes, but they said conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. That's still the terminology used. And of course, that also marked the beginning of a sort of a switch in the paradigm, in the thinking also within the UN, where it moved from the hard CT counterterrorism paradigm towards this view on countering violent extremism. And the idea behind was to really look at conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism or root causes. But the way it was used, it rather looked at counter narratives. And it was still very much countering and taking more of a state security perspective, which was maybe a little bit more whole of government instead of only security institutions responding, but still, for sure, still not a whole society approach. And so after some time and a lot of pushback from the also civil society community, who said, well, if you really are looking for solutions, a long-term, sustainable solutions for these underlying problems, then you cannot cut us out. You have to include us in the conversations and make us part of the solutions, make us part of the design of the solutions. And so the paradigm shifted again from CT to CVE, the countering violent extremism, to PVE, to the preventing of violent extremism. And so through the years, we have seen these shifts. Nevertheless, we're still not doing very well. Looking at the trouble with jihadist terrorism, I think at the time of 9/11, compared to the number of supporters now, it's quadrupled the number of support, and we have added all kinds of other problems. With regard to the discussions in Europe, what was interesting is that here there was much more attention for these underlying causes. But here we had the discussion on whether or not it was purely motivated by religion, or whether there are other factors as well. And there were sort of two schools of thought in this. The latter also saying it's marginalization, it's perceptions of discrimination, of perceptions of deprivation, lack of chances in society to really participate, and that adds all up. And then someone comes along with a nice frame in which you can get rid of all your problems and replace it with a perfect society where it gives answers to all your problems. So there were these two thoughts. I think you need to have a combination of both to really understand it. But that's a little bit of the background of how this discussion played out in Europe.
Well, words matter. And you referred to violent extremism and to terror. Part of the problem with the United Nations approach to counter terror is that there has never been a universally accepted clear definition of terrorism, and certainly not of violent extremism. And so that gap, or those gaps, have allowed many countries, in the name of fighting terrorism, in effect, to repress civil society movements demanding freedom or demanding social justice. Just take, for example, the case of Xinjiang in China, or the repression that has taken place in Myanmar, or many other countries, or the Philippines. Many other countries where, under the banner of combating terrorism, they're really combating civil society and groups that have been repressed and are struggling to get their fair share of a modern society. So it has been hijacked in many instances by considerations of state security rather than security for the people to be free from terrorist attacks.
Thank you. Can I move on to a bit of another topic, and that's the following thing. Doug, you mentioned already how the United States waged war or started military operations in countries like Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so on and so forth. And we all remember the divisions, especially when, say, in 2003, the military actions started against Saddam Hussein. What we also have seen is that the laws of war themselves got under, I would say, considerable pressure and stretch. I give two examples. First of all, we have something what we call the right of self-defense in international law. And yes, we have this in the United Nations Charter. Even when you are attacked as a state, you have the right to defend yourself, an inherent right even to defend yourself. But what we have seen is that that right of self-defense was really stretched, and I would say continuously stretched in the past 20 years, because we have seen already after the 9/11 attacks that the idea that you could be attacked by terrorist actors, non-state actors, but that you could still take military action against a state and a government, in this case the Taliban in Afghanistan. But then you had the so-called Bush Doctrine, the US security strategy of 2002, which even advocated the idea of so-called preventative strikes without any imminent risk from the other party. We saw that further continuing. In fact, every US president since has had a bit his own military strategy. It was a bit different under Obama, it came back under Trump and what have you. But what we also have seen in the West, and including in European countries, was a further stretching up, I would say, of the right of self-defense in order to justify later on military actions in Syria, for instance, where the incumbent regime, of course, did never invite Western powers to act. It only invited Russia. And so my question to you and to the two of you is, first of all, did we go too far with regard to the notion of self-defense? And linked still to the question of the laws of war, I would like to recall this notorious statement of the then US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who argued that the 1949 Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross Conventions, had become outdated, and that they were notably not really suitable when it came to the question of enemy combatants who should, in the US view, not be given the treatment of prisoners of war and the so-called Third Geneva Convention. So there too, I would like to ask you, how did all these actions impact the law of war, international humanitarian law? Okay, please.
Well, let me put on my law professor hat and give you first a law professor answer. A unilateral position taken by the United States, or for that matter, by any other country, cannot change international law, cannot change the laws of war, doesn't amend the Geneva Conventions, doesn't repeal the Geneva Conventions, doesn't constitute customary international law. It constitutes the views of some idiosyncratic people at times of stress in a given country. Witness Mr. Rumsfeld. Secondly, a single case, such as the case of the response to Syria, even if it is partly multilateral, also does not change the Geneva Conventions, the United Nations Charter, or even necessarily customary international law. So those are the law professor answers. Single cases, single countries don't change international law. Do they, in effect, stretch international law and create precedents that over time and in the future could possibly build up in such a way as to weaken the effective force of a treaty or treaties such as the Geneva Conventions, or eventually constitute customary international law? Yes, but time will require us to see other cases and other state practice examples before we can draw either such conclusion. I would not draw either of those conclusions, either that the US position on the Geneva Conventions or the EU position on Syria yet amounts to international law. As a practical matter, and now taking off my law professor's hat and now pretending to be something of a political scientist in which I am utterly unqualified, in the United States, the laws that really matter for purposes of the laws of war are frankly not international law. They're domestic law. What purported to justify Bush's theory of preventive war back in 2001 and 2002 was a series of legal memoranda from the Office of Legal Counsel from the US Department of Justice, saying that as the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces under the US Constitution, the president was empowered to do pretty much anything he wanted to, including preventive wars. Now, since that time, and especially at present, there are multiple efforts underway specifically to repudiate the concept of preventive war. There's a bill pending in Congress right now called the National Security Powers Act, which has been introduced by the Democratic Sanders Murphy and Sanders and Republican Senator Lee, and it would declare the policy of the United States to be that the president's constitutional authority does not permit him to engage in military action without a congressional declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, and now I'm going to quote, because this is a direct repudiation of the theory of preventive war, quote, when necessary to repel a sudden attack, so that's an attack that's already taken place, or, and now for a future attack, the concrete, specific, and immediate threat of such a sudden attack on the United States, etc. So that's basically saying that the president cannot initiate military action except in cases of actual attack or preemptive attack. Now, since that's domestic law, it's not saying that in theory the Congress couldn't do it, but anyone familiar with the United States politics knows that the Congress cannot tie its own shoelaces, let alone launch a preventive war. So as a practical matter, if this bill passes and it has bipartisan support, we will not be seeing any preventive wars from the United States, aside from the position of President Biden, who will be our president for another 3 years, or his administration at least will be, that he doesn't want to engage in any more of these so-called endless wars like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Okay, thank you very much. I remember that my famous professor of international law at Yale Law School, Professor Harold Coe, has been somewhat criticized, to put it mildly, for some views he has taken as a legal counsel at the State Department. That discussion, is it still raging in the US, or is that past us?
It is not past us. Although Harold has no, I refer to Professor Coe, although I know him. Although he has no official position in the State Department, he has been an informal counselor with an office in the State Department, really calling the shots in the absence of a confirmed State Department legal advisor since, I think, February of this year. So he is very much still directing State Department legal policy. There are many issues where his views come into play. For example, the whole issue of drones that we referred to earlier. Biden came in and announced that he was going to conduct a policy review of the U.S. policy on drones, which is pretty shoot 'em up whenever you want to after the revisions by President Trump and the expanded use by President Obama. That policy review is still underway, and it will certainly be influenced by what just happened in Afghanistan and where the U.S. will come out on that and what advice Dean Coe, I should say, former dean of the Yale Law School, will give remains to be seen. The debates over Guantanamo, we're still having military commission trials that are underway right now at Guantanamo. The debates over the use of tortured information. One of the military prosecutors at Guantanamo tried to get evidence obtained through torture to be used in one of the Guantanamo trials. That debate is ongoing. The question of torture. We have an executive order against torture. We have a statute now against torture, but it has some loopholes in it. If a President Trump or someone like him comes into office again 3 years from now, will that whole question be reopened? So unfortunately, while there have been some Band-Aids, some temporary patches, we have not fixed the problems of violations of human rights in U.S. counterterrorism policy in such a legally solid way that they can't be reopened, and some of them are ongoing, such as the drone attacks.
Thank you. I'm going to invite our audience and our participants to start asking questions also in the Q&A, because I don't see any for the moment. We still have some questions ourselves, don't worry about that. But I invite reactions and questions from you all. I'm turning back to Bibi for the EU kind of position. And when you look back in those last 20 years, it's clear that with regard to counterterrorism, we have seen a lot of waves, and we have seen a lot of cycles. And in a certain way, counter-terrorist policies and legislation were almost always in a big, if you wish, push immediately after particular terrorist attacks. I mentioned Madrid, London, the Bataclan, the Brussels attacks, and so on. But then when for a while there was nothing major happening, again, it became rather, let's say, business as usual. Still, after the 9/11 attacks, there was a political momentum created, and then certain reforms were pushed through. I remember it was during the Belgian presidency of the Council of Ministers in the second half of 2001 that very important decisions on principle were taken on the so-called European arrest warrant framework decision, on the framework decision on terrorism, and so on. Now that's become a so-called directive under EU law. But can I ask you something, Bibi? How, say, much progress did we really make under European Union laws and policy with regard to working together against terrorism between member states? And of course, there's the criminal law side that is interesting to look at, but I'm thinking also of other much more delicate things, such as, for instance, the exchange of confidential intel information between national intelligence agencies, Europol, what have you. We have created a lot of agencies. How do you assess what we have done so far?
Well, yes, indeed, you rightly pointed out that there is this window of opportunity sometimes right after an attack. And even though I always had this gut feeling that that was true, some years ago with some colleagues, we did a quite elaborate scan of what was happening within the EU in terms of counterterrorism, and we put it in a timeline. And indeed, we found out that it was always right after the attacks that these new initiatives were tabled. And maybe they were, as an idea, already collecting some dust, and someone was waiting for the right opportunity to bring them forward, because they knew that there would be less discussion on the necessity of these new measures. And even though in those situations, what one never did was a proper needs assessment, or to do a policy gap assessment to see whether any of these measures were really necessary, or whether you rather needed to adjust some of the measures that were already there, because one also does not conduct any monitoring or evaluation of policies. And that's quite shocking. I think it's, excuse me, looking at the policies between 2001 and 2016, we noticed that looking at the ambitions that were tabled, the strategies, the actions plans, the bodies established, the international agreements, and what have you, all in all, to look at all of that, we noticed that only 12% of all these measures and initiatives were dedicated to monitoring and evaluation. Whereas if you are seriously looking at, or you want to ensure that there is effectiveness in the measures, I would say you need half of them, because you really are serious with making sure that your measures are effective. So this is one thing. And it always seems that there's also sort of this Pavlov reaction after attacks, where policymakers, politicians need to show that they can, or show strength, and put out very harsh measures as a way of saying we are not weak, we can handle this. On the other hand, there has been an enormous amount of new measures tabled, as you mentioned. You already mentioned a few, but looking at the architecture of the EU and all the different organs that are engaged in either CT, CVE, or PVE, it's really quite, you almost need a PhD to fully understand all of these organs and all of their activities and how they interact. And even though they have this EU counterterrorism strategy, we all know that the 3PR, prevent, protect, pursue, and respond, are pillars within this strategy, sort of framing it as a comprehensive approach. If you take a closer look, it's far from comprehensive, because there is not really a good interaction. It's rather a mosaic of measures. Nevertheless, after this critical point, I must say there also have been an enormous increase in the possibility to cooperate between the different agencies, particularly on the criminal law responses, as you mentioned, and to a certain extent with regard to intel cooperation. I say the latter with a bit of hesitation, clearly because with intel cooperation, normally that is something that fully falls under the sovereignty of states, and it's always them who decide whether or not they should share this kind of information. Mostly intel is shared on a bilateral basis, because then you know exactly who you're dealing with. It's sort of quid pro quo. It's the third state rule, a need to know basis. There's all these specific rules that go to the exchange between intel agencies. There's another problem here, and that also has to do with trust. It mostly works if there is good trust between agencies on a personal level, between the people working in these organizations, backed up by institutional procedures that can, after that, sort of process the information that they are first willing to share, because there is this trust relationship. And apart from that, there is always the trouble with the compatibility of systems. how that sometimes is very technical because their computer systems are not compatible in the way that they can share information. And sometimes it also has to do with legal compatibility. There is big difference within the European Union if you look at the various nations in how they have organized their intel agencies. And some are really dedicated to only looking at security intelligence. Sometimes there is sort of a mandate that also has a responsibility or a task towards criminal intelligence and not only security intelligence. And sometimes there's a clear watershed between these organizations. In France, you have the gendarmerie, that's also slightly different. So this also makes it difficult for these agencies to fully commit to this kind of full disclosure of information if the mandates themselves not even allow the exchange within their own nation. So that's a big problem. Nevertheless, they have put up a lot of institutions and agencies and mechanisms within the EU, a lot regarding criminal justice exchange. You already mentioned Europol, and there is Eurojust, of course. Those are clear institutions that have a task in gathering intel sometimes or criminal information on specific trials, on investigations, and sharing that. But there are other systems as well. And there is for instance, the Siena network, the Europol Secure Information Exchange Network application. There is SIS, the Schengen Information System. There is the PNR, passenger name records, focal point on travelers, visa information systems, information management strategy, European Information Exchange Model, Atlas Network, European Border and Coast Guard. And the list continues. There's one I'd like to mention, which is rather funny, I think. There was a framework decision on simplifying the exchange of information and intelligence between law enforcement authorities of the member states of the EU. They know themselves so well, I would say. But again, even though there is all this information, it all comes down to the willingness of states to actually put in the data in these networks. And there is one funny story about the Germans who were very committed to the new, I think it was the European counterterrorism system within the Europol, the new database, and they put in new information about various cases. And once they were in need of some information for a particular investigation they were conducting, they were looking in the database, and all they found was their own entries of data. So they were informing themselves on previous cases. So they were a little disappointed with the results, I can imagine. But so, yes, we have moved forward in cooperation, and there have certainly been good results in exchange between nations. Also, the 24/7 operational centers, where if a terrorist act is committed immediately, all the focal points in the different agencies are ready to look into their databases and look for connections and pieces of information that can connect the dots. So there's been some good results here, but as I mentioned, that's mostly on the criminal justice approach. Intel still remains a big challenge, I'd say.
May I turn to that now with speaking of intelligence, because the United States has always been extremely reluctant to share its own intelligence information, with the exception of a few countries. And my question to you, Doug, is do you think it could be improved, especially should the EU and the US work together towards sharing more and deeper intelligence information? Next to that, I would like to ask you the question, do you think that the quality of US intel is always that good? I mean, there have been some cases that seem to illustrate that that is not always the case, but I'm not sure. Is it the quality of intel, or is it the, let's say, the way in which the political system deals with the intel? Please.
Well, clearly the quality of intelligence information, and frankly by any government, not just the United States, but by the United States intelligence agencies, has not been consistently good on the biggest questions. We all remember the so-called weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist in Iraq. And more recently, we've seen intelligence estimates that alerted President Biden to the collapse of the Afghanistan government and military, perhaps within weeks at a minimum, but maybe they would last for a year. Clearly, that was so far away from reality that one could qualify that as an intelligence failure. At the same time, it is true that there has been tremendous pressure explicitly placed by President Trump, but always implicit under any president, for the intelligence community to tell the president what it wants to hear. And that, I think, tends to skew intelligence in a way that undermines its quality, and also just the nature of intelligence collection. It's gathered through sources of information, many of which are what legally we would call hearsay or second or third hand, many of which are human sources whose credibility is often debatable. So intelligence information by its very nature does not have the quality that one would expect in a court of law if you were trying to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, in that background, could the United States share intelligence information with the European Union? In general, no. The United States does have an intelligence sharing agreement with the so-called Five Eyes, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all English speaking, all with a similar common law background, with the exception of Quebec, all with a great deal of cultural and political similarity, at least before the advent of the most recent or the previous US president, who stepped a bit out of line. But to go beyond that, to share intelligence with the EU, which includes governments such as that of Viktor Orban in Hungary, or others in Central Europe right now, which are clearly not respectful of democratic values and could use intelligence information to repress dissidents within their own populations, or with governments, and I won't mention any specific countries here, but there have been revolving door governments in some countries, and some of the revolving doors are not always entirely serious or reliable. The United States is just not going to make a general commitment to share intelligence with as large a collection of states as the EU. Does that mean it can never share intelligence? Of course not. On a case-by-case, a situation-by-situation basis, they can evaluate the benefits of sharing and the risks of sharing, and sharing could go on. And alternatively, to the extent a problem affects member states of the EU or certain member states, rather than the EU as a whole, they could, as BB pointed out a moment ago, share it on a bilateral or something of a multilateral basis with some caution. But a general commitment to expand the Five Eyes to make it 32 eyes, I don't see that.
No, I see your point now. Can I basically ask you also the question, were you surprised when the media revealed that the, say, mobile phone of German Chancellor Angela Merkel was being spied upon by the United States?
I wish I could say that I was surprised. No, I was not. The United States intelligence community apparently feels free to surveil the telephones and the internets and the emails of anybody in the world. Now, in having been caught in that kind of an embarrassing situation, I presume they curtailed it a bit. But the surveillance, the electronic surveillance capabilities of the National Security Agency and others in the intelligence community here is vast, and the bias of the operators of those systems is to gather information rather than to respect any boundaries on information gathering. So no, I was not surprised.
Okay, now, I mean, as you have said, there is so much information gathering, and through so many different instruments and mechanisms, I sometimes wonder whether it's not just a real mountain of hay, and that, you know, lots of additional measures mechanisms, agencies were created. So I wonder whether there is a kind of incredible, I would say, overproduction of or collection of data in the US, something which has also been revealed, as Sylvia in our chat box is saying, by Snowden. And that seems to make it more difficult even to really, let's say, find relevant intel instead of really like solving issues. I mean, do you think there are just too many mechanisms, agencies, and so on? How does this end up on the desk of the president, I sometimes wonder?
Well, first of all, in defense of the U.S. intelligence community, we have far fewer agencies than that list that Bibi was reading that the EU has. That's stunning. I don't know how you can possibly operate in that kind of an institutional setting.
To the defense, these are multiple nations, and then there is this organization. You're right there, but I think the US has some problems there as well. Particular running up to 9/11, was it the FBI who was already following a certain breadcrumb that the CIA was sort of blocking, and they missed the cues. For those who haven't seen The Looming Tower, I highly recommend that.
That's right. The problem, one problem with gathering too much intelligence, is, especially when it's in foreign languages, and time is necessary to get translations. There were apparently reports before 9/11 that would have given us more specific warning, but they weren't translated in time, and they didn't get up to senior decision makers in time. So that's a problem. On the other hand, the argument that the operators of the system make is the only way we can find the little nuggets, find the little pieces of information that are going to be worth a great deal of importance in making policy decisions, is by gathering everything and then sorting it. And the other side of that equation, of course, is that it means that huge numbers of people who have a right to privacy, including everyone who's listening in on this program today, and all three of us who are on the screen, but hundreds of millions of citizens of different countries throughout the world have a right not to have our personal information recorded by the CIA or the NSA or the FBI, and yet it is in massive amounts, with the support of President Bush in his day, Bush 2, but also of Obama and Trump, and it's ongoing under Biden as well. And Edward Snowden was only one of those, there are not many, but only one of those people who have revealed the massive extent of surveillance and data gathering about all of us, whether we are citizens or inhabitants of the United States or Europe or anywhere else. And that needs to be weighed against the value that the intelligence agencies argue that they find by gathering everything and eventually sifting out the few nuggets of information they really want.
I think there's even maybe a larger or more of a meta implication to the tendency of our governments to want to gather all pieces of information, and that it's also sort of frames almost everyone as a criminal, and you have to prove that you're not. It's only once they go through the information and say, okay, you're cleared. And that also does something to societies. It again puts at a discussion this sort of a social contract we have, this communities of trust that are no longer trusting each other. And I think that is what is undercutting our societies and making it so difficult to come out of these problems if we take a step back and look over these last 20 years and reflect on where we are standing now. I don't think we are in a better place now, unfortunately.
Well, you refer to megatrends, and that leads me to a broader question of to what extent have the practices of counterterrorism and their excesses over the last 20 years, not only the last 20 years, but especially the last 20 years, placed in danger the very existence of a true democracy. I can't speak for the extent to which that has played out in Europe, but I think it's a serious question. in the United States. A couple of political scientists a year ago published a book in which they surveyed American history and said that whenever you have certain features of society, democracy tends to be reduced in its quality. And those four features, if I recall them correctly, include polarization, where instead of deciding that you're going to debate with people and reach common ground, you decide the other person is an enemy that you can't trust. And that's true on both sides. And it means you get the kind of almost ships passing in the night debates that we now have in the US Congress and in the US public. In the US context, where racist practices have allowed to go into excess, as they have periodically throughout our history. Most recently, we see that in the criminal justice arena, but not only. Where the economy is such that large numbers of people are in economically difficult circumstances, and where there is an exclusion of certain groups from the polity and an aggrandizement of executive powers. Now, if that sounds like a description of what happened during the last 4 years under President Trump, then you, I think, found exactly what the warning of these groups is, but there are these political scientists is, but they're not saying, oh, Trump is gone, at least temporarily, and therefore we're okay. They're saying these are long-term trends. And if Trump doesn't make it in 2025, 2024, maybe someone else will. But if these trends are still there, how far away are we from having the United States of America become like Hungary or the Philippines today? 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that was unthinkable. It's no longer unthinkable. I hope it's unlikely, but it's not unthinkable.
Yes, very worrying, and also happening, as you say, in Europe. Can I bring the following point up? The US and the European Union like to present themselves as like-minded actors based on the same fundamental values. I mean, it's in many of the transatlantic declarations of their summits, including the one of June of this year in Brussels. And I mean, I would like to ask the two of you whether you agree that, in fact, we share the same fundamental values. Let me go back to, the years after 9/11, when there was also a lot of dialogues and policy exchanges between the Bush administration and the European Union. I remember you mentioned Professor Harold Coe, but there was at the time, as the legal counsel of the State Department, Mr. John Bellinger III, I should say, he came regularly to Brussels. And I know that there were indeed, really exchanges with very senior legal counsel from the national ministries of foreign affairs of the member states, including on the difficult or delicate issue of torture and the very notion of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. Now, there was in those days this, White House memo, which was discussed about and which gave a very, very, let's say, narrow definition of the notion of torture. But the Europeans tried to convince the Americans that, certain practices such as the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, waterboarding, but also the practice of so-called extraordinary renditions, that these were things that actually were not allowed under international law. And they were referring to the UN Anti-Torture Convention and so on. The Americans, who were always very good in terms of creative legal reasoning, they rebuffed that and they said, no, for various reasons, this is not correct, and so on and so forth, which I must say I admire in American lawyers. It's indeed the creative skill of, let's say, constructing things in such a way that, that you can even argue the unarguable. But I mean, Doug, how did you see that? But the fundamental question, indeed, bringing us back, is the question of, are we like-minded? Can we say that there is something like deeply shared fundamental values? Because that's a very important question for the future of transatlantic relations. Doug?
I think you can. It depends on the level of generality at which you want to make that statement. If we look around the world today, how many countries, how many societies are committed to principles of competitive elections, real competitive elections, and the choice of rulers through elections. How many countries today are committed to principles of an independent judiciary, albeit imperfect, but an independent judiciary? How many countries today are truly committed to principles of the rule of law? How many countries today are truly committed to principles of preventing the state from committing overt violence against large numbers of its citizens of particular religious or racial or political ideological backgrounds? At that level of generality, it seems to me, yes, the United States and Western Europe, and I would add Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries, Costa Rica and Uruguay in the Western Hemisphere, for example, share fundamental common values. But once you go below that, but it's important to start, I think, with that concept. We share something in common that, frankly, we do not share with Saudi Arabia, or with India, or with China, or with Russia, or with Venezuela, or with Cuba, or I could go on to many others. But once you go beyond that and you get down to the level of the differences, the United States having been willing to come up with clever legal arguments to support terrorism and extraordinary renditions and and all the rest of this stuff, then of course there are differences, and thank God there are differences, because at a time when the United States was abandoning what should have been its principles, at least the Europeans, the Western Europeans, the European Union, and the UK stood up for values and should have been shaming the Americans for the positions we were taking. So those differences are good, and they reflect, I think, a lot of realities. I'll mention just one. 20 years ago, and to a lesser extent today, the United States came from a tradition, especially out of World War II and the post-war period, of thinking we're big enough and tough enough, we can do what we want unilaterally, and we don't need international law, and we don't need multilateral institutions. Well, the Europeans were incapable of such self-delusion, because you realized that you needed your countries to band together into multilateral institutions, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and others, and to work with even larger multilateral institutions such as the UN to engage in cooperative international approaches to solve global problems. Now, the United States can no longer go it alone against global problems like COVID, like global warming. So the idea of unilateralism, it seems to me, is out of date. But that was informing the differences between the United States, among other things, between the United States and Europe 20 years ago, and to some extent today.
Bibi, I mean, these were very wise words, and you know that in a way, the reaction to what happened also in 2002, 2003, was that we wrote into our EU treaties this very deep commitment of the European Union to multilateralism. It's also in the so-called European Security Strategy of 2003, not coincidentally 2003. It was a way of getting back our act together, because let's face it, in the wake of, confronted with the Iraq war, Europeans were divided, and you had very divided governments. You had lots of people on the street, but you will remember that there was this so-called Azores summit, in which say leaders like the Spanish and the Portuguese leaders were having a summit with President Bush, whereas, for instance, the French president of the days, Jacques Chirac, and the German chancellor in that time, Gerhard Schröder, were fiercely against the Iraq invasion. So let me ask you that question, Bibi. It's like, how truly committed do you think the Europeans are to multilateralism? Are we really, is that sometimes not a form of lip service, or do you think, no, it's really real? We want to work through, for instance, the United Nations, and we want to advance, let's say, the fight against terrorism, with combining it also with respect for rule of law and human rights. Is that all correct, or would you be more critical about that?
Well, I think Doug already gave part of that answer in the sense that within Europe, we are very much aware that we cannot solve these big problems alone, and we do need these forms of multilateralism to come up with effective responses. Nevertheless, of course, we are as much as divided as we are united sometimes in certain topics, and when it really comes to these basic questions on whether or not there is a legal basis for a military invasion, I think that it's good that states also speak up and give sort of a counter argument to those who have a tendency to take a position that might also undermine the basic principles of international law. So in that sense, yes, multilateralism, I think, is still pretty much guiding the agendas, but there are always these divisions. But even though we have these frames and these institutions that we'd like to work with, at the same time, also within the EU, you see that, or within Europe, I should say, you see that even these basic values are eroding a bit. And Doug was saying, or you were saying about the extraordinary renditions. Well, here we also had big discussions on extradition with diplomatic assurances or deportations with diplomatic assurances, and the criticisms from human rights organizations saying, well, you know, with if you are extraditing with a diplomatic assurance that someone is not tortured, it's like creating a little island of legality in an ocean of illegality. And how are you on earth checking whether they live up to these promises? And if you don't have these systems in place, then that's at least then this whole idea of deportation with diplomatic assurance is void. Circumventing the principle of non-refoulement. There's also the discussion on deprivation of nationality, for instance, and here, well, no longer within the EU, but the UK has this position that they can deprive someone of its nationality, citizenship, if there is still a chance that someone can get another nationality. Normally, the international law would say that there is a prohibition for someone to become stateless. So if someone has only one nationality, you cannot deprive that person of the nationality. And only can do it if they have 2 or 3 nationalities. But the UK is of the position, well, we can deprive someone of their nationality if there is a chance that they can get a nationality somewhere else. Well, the reason that someone is deprived of their nationality is because they are related to terrorist attacks. What nation on earth would use that in a resume for someone to grant them a nationality? So it's also sort of a twisted position that's taking place. But and still, we also have the discussions on whether or not we should repatriate women and children from Syria and Iraq. And even though with women, you could still make an argument that they might have been involved in these the terrorist activities of the organization and that they pose a threat to nationality. But if it comes to children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child says clearly that you should put the best interest of the child first. And this is not what European nations are doing at this moment. So yes, we have the values, but I'm also quite critical about the erosion of all of these values.
It's a subject we could really deepen, but I have to, I mean, since our time is slowly running out, we still have around 10 minutes. I feel I should bring up the subject of the United Nations also because one of our participants has raised a question about it. And the question is basically, you know, in the United Nations, there are lots of conventions, treaties against all kinds of terrorist practices, around, say, 20 or almost conventions if you also count the protocols. But what we are sorely lacking in the UN, and Doug has pointed to that already, is a comprehensive convention defining the very notion of terrorism. That's because we simply never found consensus on that. You know, the famous saying that one person's say freedom fighter is another person's terrorist and vice versa. In the UN, where we were never able to really come up with a consensual definition of terrorism. And I mean, there is this draft comprehensive convention that apparently does not seem to make any progress. So let me ask you about what you think about that. Do you think it may be possible to reach a kind of global consensus with regard to the very notion of terrorism? And let me expand a little bit on the United Nations, because as we have mentioned, a very strong role has been played in those past 20 years by the UN Security Council. Now, that's of course a very remarkable place where you have 5 permanent powers with veto rights and so on. But if you see the activities past 9/11, terrorism has always been on their agenda. They condemned nearly all terrorist attacks ever since. They have adopted even what I would call lawmaking resolutions, really legislating in a sense, compelling all the 193 member states of the United Nations to incorporate in their national legislation very far-reaching criminal provisions with regard to terrorism, say the financing of terrorism, and so on and so forth. So I would like you to comment, if I may, on this question. First of all, what about the possibility or non-possibility of arriving at a global consensus on the very notion of terrorism? And secondly, whether you think indeed the UN Security Council is such a proper venue for adopting global norms in the fight against terrorism. Can I ask that first maybe to Bibi and then go to Doug?
Yes, sure, Jan. No, it's a very crucial question indeed. Well, the quick answer to the question, is there any chance that on a global level we would ever come to a definition? I think the answer is no, unfortunately. That's not because legally it's not possible, it is. It's just a matter of lack of political will. But funny enough, I actually started my PhD research in 2001. I was granted a fund to do my research in the spring of 2001, and the key question of my research was on the definition of terrorism. Well, and I actually started 1 week before 9/11. So a week and a day after I started my research, I could put it aside because I knew that from that day on, of course, everything was developing in a different direction. At first, because it seems that there was this window of opportunity to finally come to this resolution. They were quite close, but at one point states also started to realize that there is it's sometimes they need the flexibility to move a little bit, and that was, sorry to say, but particularly the promotion of the US to not really touch on this definition and others to follow. Of course, this turned out to be a big problem throughout, and we already touched upon that problem, because there are regimes that are actually using the lack of a definition to deal with their political opponents the way that it suits them best. So it's very problematic. It's not only the lack of a definition of terrorism, it's also the lack of a definition of violent extremism. It's the lack of a definition of foreign fighters, and I can continue. However, what is interesting is that there is also the UN Convention on Combating the Financing of Terrorism. And in that convention, actually, what they needed to do in order to prohibit the financing of something, they also needed to define something that was terrorism. So there is, as I said, there are legal ways to deal with that. Even the Security Council at one point in Resolution 1566 came up with a definition of terrorism. However, that was a non-binding definition and never really referred to back in sequel resolutions that were adopted. If we look on the other side to the regional organizations, there you see that they have been able to come up with resolutions or definitions of terrorism So there it's a little easier. You have more like-minded states, perhaps, and there is more of a will to solve this issue. You can still debate whether these are good definitions, of course, but you do have them. Now, the second part of your question was
the Security Council. But may I go back to Doug now? Because Doug, I mean, on this lack of a UN definition, do you share Bibi's view that it's not very likely we may obtain a global consensus on this?
Yes, I do, in short. We've been trying to get a global consensus on this for at least 30 years, and we haven't been able to, and I don't see any reason to be optimistic that we are getting any closer to that goal. And in part, it's because states have differing interests in wanting to support armed groups. But I think, and that was the obstacle at the beginning. But I think now, maybe even more than that, is that states want to be able to qualify their domestic political opponents as terrorists. That is not something which is happening in the United States, or as far as I know, in Western Europe. And that's an example of the shared fundamental values we have. In the United States, the focus on domestic terrorism is against domestic right-wing groups, not generally, but those which advocate or are using violence. But in other countries around the world, outside the shared fundamental values of the United States and Europe, there certainly is a desire to be able to label your opponents as terrorists. There are many examples of that having been done. And once you label them as terrorists, then you can use all the expanded tools of counterterrorism, which the Security Council and individual governments have come up with, and apply them toward people they were never intended to be used against in the first place. So I'm not optimistic. And on the other question about the Security Council becoming a lawmaking body, of course, that's to some extent unavoidable, but it is extremely uncomfortable. The notion that a body of 15 states, of whom 10 are there for only 2 years on a rotating basis, and essentially 5 states can, in effect, declare laws for a world community that consists of something on the order of 200 states and even more semi-states. So I'm uncomfortable with the Security Council undertaking much of a lawmaking role, although certainly you can justify it more in the area of security, which is what terrorism is. If only we could confine terrorism or counterterrorism to actual threats to security as opposed to threats to the political viability of a given autocrat in a given country at a given time.
I would like to end our seminar, if I may, with a very broad overall question to which I would like to invite first Bibi and then Doug's reply, and that is, Professor Philip Sands once wrote a book called Lawless World, and indeed criticizing all the, say, developments post 9/11 and what has happened. And could you maybe give a very generic kind of assessment of how you see the world is evolving, how international law is evolving? Do you think that post 9/11 we have indeed evolved towards a more lawless world, or would you just say no? I mean, international law has responded to the challenges and is doing okay. It's a very generic question, I know, but I would like to have a European and an American perspective. So, Bibi.
Well, first of all, we're not doing okay. I think we can all agree to that, looking at the current situations all over the world and the problems in all of our societies. In terms of law, whether or not we move to a lawless world, I want to say that there are two sides to this answer. First of all, also within Europe, but also internationally, I think we moved forward in norm creating on hard security issues in particular, being very strong and specific on the kind of obligations that states have to implement, the kind of regulations that need to be in place in border security, in financing, in you name it. It really touched on every aspect of daily lives. But then when it comes to norm enforcement, when it comes comes to human rights obligations, I think there we are lacking behind. So if you take a look at Security Council resolutions, or if you look at what the Global Counterterrorism Forum, this body that's kind of a G20 for counterterrorism, is doing, and how they play out with the various topics they touch upon, they are very specific in the good practices needed and the exact regulations that states need to enforce and put in place when it comes to the hard security responses. And then they may say, and yes, of course, we have to abide by international law and human rights law and refugee law while doing that. But that's just not good enough, because you have to be more specific in how that plays out and how you can balance the two. And there, I think we are really lacking behind in what should be a rule of law approach to the problem, as opposed to the lawless world that you were describing.
Professor Castle.
First of all, I have great respect for Philippe Sands. His title, Lawless World, is clearly intended to be a provocative rhetoric. The world is not either entirely free of or entirely ruled by law. That's all obvious. But there's certainly some things to be said for moving toward that title in the current state of affairs. Russia's de facto invasion of Ukraine, the treatment of the Palestinians by Israel, the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which some have characterized as genocide and others as at least crimes against humanity by China. China's refusal to abide by the ruling of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea with regard to the waters off South China, bordering the Philippines and Vietnam and other countries. Examples of some of the activities of the United States, which we have already mentioned. So is international law in many respects weaker now and frankly for the foreseeable future than it has been at some times in the past? Probably yes, because we're moving toward a more multipolar world in which some of those poles, again, do not share the fundamental values that the European Union and the United States have, even if we fall far short of actually respecting those fundamental values, as Bibi pointed out. On the other hand, with respect specifically to the kinds of excesses that were engaged in by the United States in the war against the so-called war against terror 15 years ago, there have been some improvements. There have been, however imperfect and temporary they might be, restrictions on terrorism. The black sites were closed. Extraordinary renditions have gone down to zero or close to it. Guantanamo is down to 39 prisoners now, and there's an effort to get it down to zero. There have been some progress, which we should not ignore. The world is not doomed to get ever worse. Efforts by people like those in your listening audience and in your universities and your think tanks can make a difference, and we need to encourage people to keep making those efforts, because if we don't make those efforts, then the world really will go more toward the direction of lawless, as Sands warned many years ago.
Thank you so much to both speakers, Dr. Bibi van Ginkel, Professor Doug Castle. It was great to have a conversation with you. I would not dare to summarize these rich conversations, but I think it's fair to say that we kind of agree that the US and the European Union can, if they act together and if they stay true to their own fundamental values, they can together be a force for the good in the world. And you have rightly and critically pointed to many of the shortcomings in both the American and European positions and practices, but I hope that at least through some of your say reflections, we have also heard hopeful signs that things can improve if we really want to in this very complicated, turbulent world. So thank you again to both of you and to our audience for your participation, for your questions. I would say, please stay tuned with the America Europe Fund. We will be back in touch with lots of future events. Thank you very much and have a very good afternoon or evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Jan.
having us. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Enjoyed it. Bye.